And we'll start the webinar and give folks a few minutes to log in. Post some information here in the chat. All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's live online event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica, one of the co-owners of Greenlight, and we are so honored to be able to host tonight's community forum presented by the Prospect Lefferts Gardens Neighborhood Association. The topic of the forum is Defund, Abolish, Reform the Police, the NYPD and public safety after the murder of George Floyd. And we're honored to have State Senator Zellnor Myrie and author and educator Alex Vitale with us here tonight, along with members of PLGNA. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to PLGNA and to our panel of experts tonight for giving their time for this discussion, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community is still here, and we're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple little housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the panelists and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we very much encourage. The first way is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat as we go. It's a great way to show your appreciation and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by one of the panelists, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find that by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. We are recording for tonight's event, so look for audio and video versions on our social media channels later on. If you'd like to support your neighborhood independent bookstore and allow us to continue to bring you books and programming for the neighborhood, you can shop in our store locations 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day, or shop online at greenlightbookstore.com, and we thank you for your support. Alex Vitale's book, The End of Policing, is one of many relevant titles you can find at Greenlight on these subjects. I'll drop the buy link for that book in the chat shortly. All right, some introductions. Brenda Edwards, who will be one of our moderators this evening, is the president of the Prospect Lefferts Gardens Neighborhood Association and a longtime community resident. She's now retired. She's a former high school English teacher who taught as well as an adjunct at New York City Technical College. And she's joined as a moderator by Deborah Mutnick, who's a member of the PLGNA Board of Directors and also a longtime community resident. She's a professor of English at Long Island University, Brooklyn, and the project director of the Voices of Lefferts Community Writing Project, the beautiful results of which we are proud to stock at Greenlight. So we're grateful to Brenda and Deborah for moderating this evening. Our PLGNA representatives will be interviewing our two distinguished guests this evening. New York State Senator Zellnor Myrie is a Brooklyn native and affordable housing advocate serving the 20th Senate District. Among other legislative achievements, he served on the Senate's Criminal Justice Reform Working Group, resulting in reforms to cash bail, discovery, and speedy trial laws, and has been publicly recognized for his work, including City and State's Rising Stars Award, the Lindsay Fellowship in Government Leadership and Practice, and many other community awards. And Alex Vitale is a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. Professor Vitale is the author of multiple books, including most recently The End of Policing, and his writings have been published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, among others. And he's also appeared often on radio and television shows, including Democracy Now! And The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. So they'll both be speaking tonight on a national topic that affects our neighborhoods intimately. During the global pandemic, countless numbers of Black men and women in the US were gunned down by the police. George Floyd's death on May 25, 2020, after Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, led to massive multiracial street protests in the US and abroad. On April 20, 2021, a multiracial jury in Minneapolis found Chauvin guilty of all charges, including second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. During the Chauvin trial alone, at least 64 people died at the hands of police, more than half of whom were people of color. Calls for abolition, defunding, and police reform are louder than ever. In our own neighborhood, years after stop and frisk was ruled unconstitutional, NYPD officers routinely stop Black men, women, and youth on grounds of looking suspicious or fitting a vague description, causing trauma and necessitating the talk Black parents give their children about what to do not if, but when they will be confronted by the police. In this context, Zellnor and Alex will each begin with an opening statement, and then Brenda and Deborah will be asking them some questions, and then they'll take your questions as well. So to start us off, please join me in welcoming Zellnor Myrie. Take it away.
Thank you, Jessica. And first, let me thank Greenlight, PLGNA, Brenda, Deborah, Alex for putting this on tonight. I'm firstly very glad to be with the community virtually. Many of you know I had a pretty serious bout with COVID for the past couple of months that kept me out of action. So I want to thank all of the community members that have sent warm messages and well wishes. Much, much, much appreciated. And I'm glad to be well on my way to recovery. I'm also very excited about the topic at hand tonight. Many of you know that soon after we found out about George Floyd, one of the first protests that happened in the city was at the Barclays Center, not too far from our neighborhood. I went out there as a state senator, but also as a Black man that grew up on Flatbush my whole life. And I went with a very bright neon shirt that had my name and title on the back. I went to be a peacemaker, to be a liaison between my community and the police department, and ended up, for the first time in my life, getting pepper sprayed, assaulted, and put in handcuffs by the New York Police Department. Shortly thereafter, I was in the building that you see right behind me, in the Senate chamber, passing reforms to how we do policing here in the state of New York. But I am under no illusion. It is not nearly enough. Much more needs to be done. And I'm excited to talk with the panel tonight about what that looks like.
All right, I'll take it from there. Thanks, Zellnor, and thanks everyone for this invitation. It's lovely to be doing an event here in Brooklyn with my neighbors on the other side of the park. I've been living in Brooklyn for close to 30 years now, and this is an issue that is very close to my heart, obviously. After the police killing of Eric Garner, Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and so many others in that period about 6-7 years ago, we were told policing was going to get reformed. The Obama administration issued a big task force, created a task force that issued all kinds of recommendations, and a lot of cities implemented a wide variety of reforms. Here in New York, police were given body cameras, were given implicit bias training, were given de-escalation training. There was tightening up of some policies. The officers in Minneapolis involved in the killing of George Floyd had had implicit bias training, mindfulness training, de-escalation training, were wearing body cameras, were operating under a more restrictive use of force policy, were operating under a new policy that required officers to intervene if they saw misconduct by a fellow officer. And they were operating under a new early warning system to identify problematic officers. And none of it made any difference. And after 6-7 years of police reform, the police continue to kill about 3 Americans a day. And I don't think anyone who saw the handling of the protests this summer by the NYPD, as well as departments across the country, can claim with a straight face that the police have been reformed, that they have learned to de-escalate, that they are in touch with the concerns of the community, that they are doing community policing. What we saw was the brutal repression of a movement for liberation. And I think this has forced people to have a change of heart, to acknowledge that police reform, certainly by itself, is not going to fix these problems, and giving more money to institutions like the NYPD to fix themselves is just unlikely to produce the kinds of results we want. And that's why this past summer, no one was holding up a sign saying more money for police body cameras, more money for police training. No, they were holding up signs saying defund the police. And what is meant by that is not tomorrow we find some magical switch that doesn't exist and poof, all police are gone. There's no way to do that. And that's not even what people are calling for. What they're calling for is a process of interrogating the functions that we've turned over to the police and asking in every situation, is this really the only way we could deal with this? Is this really the best strategy to have people with guns manage discipline in our schools, deal with people having a mental health crisis, responding to people who are homeless having a crisis, to deal with young people in crisis who may be involved in violence? No, we don't need police for these things. We have evidence-based examples of programmatic interventions to make our communities safer than they are today, where we only rely on police. This means bringing back counselors to schools, creating community-based mental health services, creating community-based anti-violence efforts to deal with youth, to deal with families in crisis. It means actually housing our neighbors so that they're not a source of danger to themselves or others. So I look forward to continuing the conversation and seeing what kind of concrete strategies we can advance today to help resolve some of these deep problems.
Thank you both, Zellnor and Alex. So happy to see you here. This has been a long time coming. Since the summer, we've been trying to put this together, so I'm so appreciative. You've answered some of the questions that I had planned to ask, and I'm sure that in the Q&A, it's funny because you said, Alex, that no one's holding up a sign to say, fund the police, but actually, one of my neighbors today, when they saw our advertisement for this forum, they were livid. They're like, give more funds to the police. They actually said that. I don't think that people completely understand. You just explained it. Exactly what reforming, or which I don't even know if that's the right word to use now, but people are still very confused about what this means. They seem to feel that they're going to be, that they're not going to be safe. And they don't understand ways in which the community can actually participate in bringing about change where they can be safe under different, under a different situation. So, so with that, I'm going to ask Zellnor about some of the challenges that you've had in working with your colleagues up in Albany, and about some of the bills that you've been able to pass that will actually keep us safer without having putting in more money for the police, actually taking some away. I think there's 150A that I would like for you to talk about a bit.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I think this is a really important point, in that there is a spectrum of interpretation on what defund means or what abolition means. And I think when you take the words on their face, it's pretty simple, but I think it's more complex and it's more nuanced than that. The folks who are abolitionists, there are some folks that do feel that we need no policing whatsoever. I don't believe that's representative of most of what abolitionists feel. They are concerned about a different model of public safety, one that does not prioritize law enforcement, but one that is preventative and one that is an investment into the community. But that interpretation of what public safety looks like is very ingrained in the community and in our politics. We have to acknowledge that it was just in 2014 that a progressive city council voted to put thousands of more cops on the streets. And this was them responding to their communities who did not feel safe. And I don't think people are not being genuine when they say, when I see more cops, that makes me feel safe. That is what people are used to. Those are the structures that have been held up. So when you have that sort of level of ingraining of what public safety looks like politically, even an incremental change, like let's make public the disciplinary records, meets massive opposition. And so when we tried to, when we first introduced the repeal of 50A many years ago, it was dead on arrival, had no shot of happening. And even when the Democrats came into the majority, that's when I entered the state Senate, it was still very tough to get across, not because of the Republican opposition, they're going to be sort of diametrically opposed, but because there were Democrats that were opposed to the revealing of disciplinary records for law enforcement, responding again to the strength of the police union in some of those forces. What changed that was what happened last summer. And it is instructive for how I think we should move forward. There was so many people on the streets, so many people making calls, so many people forcing us to talk about this issue, that a bill that was dead on arrival ended up being passed 12 days after I was pepper sprayed. And I think it, you know, again, 50A was a great step forward. I'm very proud to have been part of that. But 50A alone will not reform the police and will not in and of itself make us safer. What I believe actually makes us safer is something we passed this year, which was the Community Violence Intervention and Prevention Act. And what that was here is a non-police solution to the violence and crime in our community. Let's dedicate our dollars to our violence interrupters, our community-based violence intervention programs, and our hospital-based intervention programs. We declared gun violence a public health crisis for the first time in the state's history, and we believe we're the only state in the nation to have done so, to change the approach to public safety. And you know, I think that is, you know, and again, we got a little bit of money, you know, $10 million a year for it, as compared to the money that's spent on policing, but I'm sure that's something we'll get into later. But that's where I think we need to focus our energies, while recognizing how ingrained this, like, the traditional model of public safety is.
You know, I absolutely agree with that. And part of the problem here, right, is that people have been told that the only tool they can have to address their public safety concerns is policing. And so then they hear someone wants to take away the one tool they've been told they can have. And so they're like, no, I want more tools because I have very real public safety concerns. And no one's trying to minimize that. These are real concerns. What we have to do is we have to change that equation. We have to give people other choices. And that means we have to lay out what these alternatives would look like, the evidence behind them. And I also agree that it's going to take time. I don't think this is something that we can just do overnight. This has to be about putting a new set of infrastructures in place to address concerns about violence, homelessness, untreated mental health and substance abuse problems. But these same communities that will sometimes say we want more police, when we also ask them, well, are there other things that you've always wished you could have that you think would make this community a better, safer place to live? They always have a very interesting, provocative, and useful list. Yeah, there's that community center in the public housing development that's empty because there's no money to staff it. We'd like that to be up and running. My child has a mental health problem and I can't get adequate care. And so I end up having to call the police in a crisis. We need more support for our young people in schools, right? So people also know they want these other things. And part of what we're trying to do is create a political space where they have those options, where we can start to think about public safety more holistically and avoid this false choice between police or nothing.
This is such an interesting conversation and so important to have. Zellnor, I completely agree with you that it's people on the streets that are going to push political change. And I was also, as you know, most of us were very heartened by the protests last summer. But I'm also struck by the tensions and contradictions, you know, that we're beginning to flesh out. And I wonder if you could both, maybe Alex, you could start this time, talk a little bit more about those tensions. One of the points you make at the end of your book, Alex, is that there's a very startling fact. Since 1900, the police in Great Britain have killed a total of 50 people. In March 2016 alone, US police killed 100 people. And that's such a startling fact when you see it, you know, right before your eyes. And so I wonder if you could both talk a little bit about how did we get here? How did we get to this point where the police are so militarized? How did we get to the point where the police are so heavily funded? And how do we address the kinds of problems that you're raising about, you know, anti-violence, funding for anti-violence training and for schools and for resources that people need when, first of all, we're coming out of a pandemic and there's an economic crisis. And second of all, that we've been dealing with austerity programs for years, where these services have been, you know, really eviscerated in many ways. So Alex, maybe you could start with that.
Yeah, well, I think you're on the right track there with the final thing you said, right? We have defunded communities, which have then become a source of disorder and what we think of as crime and a lack of safety. And then we've turned those problems over to police to manage, not to solve, but to manage. Now, I think this is rooted in the pressures of global competitiveness that begin in the 1970s and really escalate in the 80s and 90s, where local places are in competition with other local places all over the world. And this has created a kind of race to the bottom. And it has caused local governments to cut services, cut salaries, and redirect resources to a very small number of global economic players in hopes that they will become so successful on the global stage that some of that wealth will trickle down to the rest of us. And we saw this in New York. In the wake of the fiscal crisis of the 1970s, the city was basically handed over to Wall Street. And Wall Street was told, it's all up to you. We are going to give you a free ride, no taxes. We're going to give you real estate breaks, everything we can, if you'll save the city. Well, the result of that was not broad-based prosperity. Yes, parts of Manhattan look amazing with these new 80-story buildings and multi-billion-dollar, you know, mega rich people living for 2 weeks a year in New York City, right, which distorts the real estate market and everything. But the outer boroughs are hurting. We've got massive levels of inequality. We've got record levels of homelessness. We've got untreated mental health and substance abuse problems. We've got people desperate for basic survival. And then the city has said, well, we're going to define those problems as crime problems, and we're going to use the police on that. So people living in the subways is not a failure of housing policy. It's, oh, homeless people are out of control. You know, the New York Post saying, oh my God, out of control homeless people, we must fill the subways with police now. Well, why don't we actually just house some people? Now, of course, it's not easy to do that in New York City, but part of the problem is, and I won't belabor this too much, but part of the problem is, especially during this period of austerity, the city has decided that they're not willing to directly intervene in housing and labor markets at the level that's needed. Giuliani really established this idea. We're going to just privatize everything. And de Blasio's big intervention in housing is like the 80-20 program, imagining that market rate development is going to save us. And even the 20% that's set aside for affordability is so far beyond the reach of the median household in New York City that it's doing nothing to help the middle class, and even less to help folks who are living in homeless shelters, sleeping on people's couches. To solve that problem, we're going to need dramatic interventions in the housing markets. The governor of California, interestingly, has just announced that he's going to put 11 or 12 billion dollars of federal stimulus money into building housing for homeless people. They're going to buy hotels, they're going to build new housing to actually house people, which is something the de Blasio administration has never taken seriously.
Yeah, so, I just add, and I think, Deborah, you said a lot of good things. And, one of them, the question you asked was just how did we get here? And I think Alex explained it really well. I have to call out what I believe to be two big culprits, and that's racism and politics. And oftentimes, and certainly in the past couple of decades, it's been good politics to institute racist policies. And that is, I think, a really important thing for us to name, because if we're talking about the structures and the product of the structures over policing and all of those consequences, the root of a lot of that is, white supremacy and this country's history of suppressing Black people. But sometimes when I talk about racism in the police department, people say, well, Z, they're Black cops. How are the Black cops racist? And so we're talking about a structure that is built on interacting with the public and sending people to jail and subsequently prisons. A system in which we incarcerate more people than any other place in the world, a system in which those prisons are boons to the economy, not here in Brooklyn, but upstate New York, and a system that benefits white people. I got to call it what it is. And so I think we have, if we're not frank about those sort of the roots there, then I don't think we're going to really get to what it has been producing. And even when you look within the NYPD ranks, people say, well, by the numbers, it's majority minority now. But as you go higher in the ranks, i.e. where the decision-making happens, i.e. where the policies happen, you see less and less people of color. And I think that it is, again, when we talk about defund and reform, we're talking about a structural uprooting of what is happening in the department. And for the first time, the state, to your austerity question, for the first time in many years, this year we raised taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers, and we were told, I got the calls, I was lobbied, that it would be the end of the world. All of the businesses are gonna leave. We're in a Zoom generation. We can't take it. Meanwhile, billionaires and millionaires have become more wealthy over this past year during the pandemic. Imagine that, with massive unemployment and death and sickness, that the wealthy of us have done better. And even under that circumstance, we were told you can't raise taxes to pay for the things that would actually help to prevent crime, better housing, better healthcare, better education. But we did it. And I'm hoping that as the sort of funds flow down, which is the most money we've gotten to our public schools in a generation, that we'll start to see the effects of that.
Thank you, Zellnor and Alex. Start with Alex. You talk about this in your book, and when we've heard about this, over the years, about broken windows policy and what that means for Black and brown people and poor people. Could you talk a little bit about that, what that means?
Well, that's a perfect kind of connection to what we were just talking about, which is that was the kind of ideological mechanism that justified turning social problems into police problems. And that was really the purpose of the broken windows theory. You know, when Giuliani first ran for mayor unsuccessfully against Dinkins, he'd never heard of the broken windows theory, and he kind of ran on his history as a prosecutor and a white ethnic from the outer boroughs. But after he lost, the Manhattan Institute, deeply conservative, funded by billionaires and hedge fund guys, said, we got a little secret to tell you. There's this thing called the broken windows theory, and you can use that to blame all the city's problems on homeless people, and then claim that the solution to all the city's problems is to unleash police power on poor and vulnerable communities. And that's what the broken windows theory does. Now, the city had disorder problems. No doubt, graffiti, street level drug dealing, homeless people living in parks. This is the subject of my first book, City of Disorder. But policing is not the only possible strategy that can be used to manage these problems. We could actually try to house people. Homelessness numbers went up every year that Giuliani was mayor, and so did police spending. And this is the problem, right? We need to actually demand that the city begin to address these fundamental problems that our communities face, instead of defining them as strictly problems of crime to be policed.
If I could just add that you see the collateral consequences of over-policing even today, years after we have stopped stop and frisk. 2.3 million New Yorkers have a conviction record. And those conviction records, even after you have served your time, you have paid your dues to society, you are no longer on parole or probation, prevent you from getting housing, prevent you from getting financial aid for school, prevent you from being interviewed at jobs, it prevents you from keeping a job once they find out about your record. And then you're locked out of the community, and you're expected to not resort to criminal activity. And this is why, like, examining the collateral consequences of what has happened years ago and what will happen in the future if we don't fix it is super, super important.
I'm wondering, Jessica, if we might go to some questions from the audience since it's halfway through the session.
Yeah, we do have some questions. So I'll read those aloud, and if folks in the audience have more that they want to add, just make sure and drop them right in the Q&A. So this one is from Lunel Noel, and it's actually a question for Brenda. And she asks, in your experience working for the school system, what can you say about the school to prison pipeline?
You know, that's a good question, because I was thinking about this, especially as I read Alex's book, and I got a little depressed and happy, because, you know, Alex has solutions. But I was thinking about the school, and there were 2 police officers there, lots of security, and you know, I could see that. I used to see so many students that I knew would end up in prison because they had been criminalized. Many of them were in special ed, and you know, they would act out because they were having difficulty with the lessons. Not enough social workers in the school. There's like one social worker. There might be 2,000 to 3,000 kids in the school. There's one social worker. There's one psychologist. And that kid will rack up many suspensions. And so they will eventually, what are they going to do? You know, they're not really getting educated. Their lives are not being really taken care of. And something that Alex pointed out too was that, you know, it has to be a holistic measure. You know, you just can't take the child to the dean and not find out what's going on in the home. So yes, I did see a lot of evidence of that. And, you know, matter of fact, I was a dean at the school, and that meant taking care of problematic students. And you would see the same kids often because their problems could not be addressed because there's not enough funding in the school to help these situations. It's like a Band-Aid on it. So that's definitely that's definitely a truth. Luckily, the two police officers in the school, weren't so gung ho. They never came up. They were not allowed actually to be on the floors with the students. We would have to actually take students to them, which is, in retrospect, that's a shame. But one thing I have to say, the last thing I have to say is that one teacher who was not from this country, a very well-liked teacher, he was an African man, and he came in and he was disturbed because he saw two of our children, actually boys, the most timid, who he felt that he couldn't help them. He watched the police officers stop them on the way to school, frisk them, look in their bags. Now the same students have to come through the metal detector, take off their belts, their shoes, go through this process. Now they're very upset. You don't know, in the population of students that we had at the school, there are a lot of issues that are not taken care of. And now these students have to be frisked by the police, come through a metal detector, and whatever other issues they might have, they might act out in the class. So now, call security, of course. So this is what can happen in these school settings when the whole person life isn't addressed. So that's an issue that that's dear to my heart.
Alex and Zellnor, do you want to address the question of sort of the intersection of schools and policing? And Alex, you can go first.
Most people have a pretty good impression of the school resource officers, right? They may be from the neighborhood. They're trying to have good interactions with the kids, but they don't have the tools to address these young people's problems. They just don't. And no matter how much we train them to be nice and respectful to the children, this is not what they need. And it's not just counselors, where are the special ed teachers? We have just a dramatic lack of special ed teachers given the level of need. And so the policy basically right now, and it's not just New York, this has become the policy in so many places, is that we've just decided to X out 10 or 15% of the students in the hopes that we can save the other 85, 90%. Because we know we don't have the services to support those students. So we constantly suspend them, expel them, turn them over to security, and they are driven into the criminal justice system, where now we spend $50,000 a year to cycle them through courts and jails and prisons. And this is a nightmare. And we have got to break this cycle. There are over 5,000 NYPD personnel in New York City schools, which is more than all counselors of all varieties combined. And this speaks to the city's priorities. It's easier to lock them up than to actually address what's interfering with their learning.
Zellnor, did you want to add anything to that, or should we move to the next question? All right. Our next question is from Leah. And Leah asks, what is actually happening in this community, PLG? As a white neighbor, I don't know what's actually happening to our Black neighbors and youth with respect to the NYPD racial profiling. Is there a way to get information and an action plan based on that information going with broader community support? And she asks, what is the plan? So Zellnor, do you want to speak to that, or maybe maybe Brenda or Deborah, you want to speak a little bit more about the neighborhood specifically?
Deborah, I'm happy to defer to you if you want to jump in first.
I would just say that I think that there is still racial profiling happening in the neighborhood in a variety of ways, even though stop and frisk has officially ended. And, I think Brenda can speak to it better than I, as a parent of Black children and grandchildren now. Having to, as she put it, when we were discussing the language for the the description of this panel, giving kids the talk about how to respond when they're stopped by the police. And it's a very frightening thing. I have a nephew. He doesn't live in Brooklyn, he lives in Queens, but he is Mexican American. And he was stopped and arrested and had charges brought against him. And finally they were dismissed, but, you know, went through that whole process. And, you know, there is, I think, a kind of terror that's felt by young people in particular, but people of any age, and particularly Black and brown and non-white people. But, you know, I think white people are also sometimes picked up. And I think that class is a factor in policing. So yeah, I think that it's still happening. I'd be very curious to know your response, Zellnor, in terms of, you know, what is there a plan? Is this something that's been dealt with in this community? And if not, how can we deal with it?
Yeah, you know, it's a really good question. And as someone who grew up here, it's been a really sort of fascinating thing to now represent the neighborhood as a policymaker, because, you know, you bring your own experiences into the office and into the decision making. And, you know, I went to school here. You know, I've grown up in a rent stabilized apartment, a mom, hard worker. And I never had really bad experiences with the police growing up. In fact, I didn't really start having friction with them until I was a very grown man. You know, when you talk to the other people in the neighborhood, you talk to, you know, Leah asked, how do you find out what's going on? It's hard to find out if you can't talk to folks, right? And when I'm out on the streets and on the blocks, and those of you who know me, when I'm fully healthy, I'm always out. And when you talk to the guys, there is a serious breach of trust between them and the police department. And even when they don't feel safe, when they feel threatened by other members of the community, they don't feel like they can go talk to the police about it. So then we sort of have a perpetuation of the cycle of violence, because it's not a collective public safety model. It is one in which the police are, you know, purported to be protecting and telling you how it's done. That said, interestingly enough, this is, you know, we talk about defund the police. Our community is not monolithic on this point, right? And I think it's very, like, I think it's important for us to say that. Even between me and my mom, I know I love to talk about her a lot. You know, like, my mom was supportive of stop and frisk. She felt that this is what kept the neighborhood safe. She lived through a time here in Brooklyn when I was really young, where the crime was much higher. And if she saw a cop on the corner of Flatbush, that made her feel safer. And there are a lot of people in our community that feel that way. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that and acknowledge the sort of nuance in the feeling. But when we talk about political education, when we talk about honest conversation and being frank with each other about what do we want, what makes us feel safe, I think that's the only way we're going to really come up with a plan, like Leah is asking, because it can't just be sort of one segment of the community. You know, I represent 9 neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So in addition to my own in PLG, I got Crown Heights, I got East Flatbush, Brownsville, Park Slope, South Slope, Gowanus, Prospect Heights. And defund means different things in all of those communities. And public safety looks different in all those communities. And so we have to sort of, you know, I think collectively plan on how it can be a sort of co-model of public safety with all of us together.
We have a couple, that's a good segue. We have a couple of questions related to that sort of lack of trust that you mentioned. Lunel Noel says, what changes need to happen for the community, more specifically young Black men, to trust police officers? And Anthony Santiago asks, what do you guys think we can do as a community to build up and take care of the youth of the minority community, given the diminishing faith in police, government, and government-funded programs. So Alex, maybe you want to tackle that one.
Yeah, I think we have to ask this question more broadly, because I think alienation towards the police is symptomatic of a broader alienation. That some of the young people and adults that Zellnor is talking to out on the street, they don't feel served by the police, but they don't feel served by a lot of other aspects of government either, I think, it's safe to say. And unfortunately, in so many of these communities, the police is what the government is to them, because that's all they see. That's who they're interacting with. And so where are the other places of interaction that are seen as a positive for these young people, that provide them with a sense of opportunity and security? And this is largely lacking. And part of the reason it's lacking is because we've turned every problem into a problem for police to solve. And they don't have access to summer jobs. They don't have access to trauma counseling for young people who've experienced violence and witnessed violence. They don't have access to high quality after school activities. They don't have real mentoring. They don't have they don't have, housing for young people who are trying to live independently. So we've got to develop another face of government that is actually providing something positive to these young people. That's how we need to bring them in, so to speak. I put in the chat a kind of holistic plan for community safety from Tiffany Caban that I worked on. But each community, as Zellnor said, needs to make its own assessment. What are the real challenges we're facing? And then how can we think holistically about addressing them? And so I think the first step is to do a kind of needs assessment, speaking to the earlier question, and to have a community process for doing that, and then bring people in who can talk about a full range of potential interventions rather than just imagining it's yet another job for the police.
And I just wanted to jump in to say that the idea of community conversations seems really important to me. And I wonder if that's something, Zellnor, that you could help us facilitate. I do think that, and what you're talking about too, Alex, the plan that you just referred to, and a needs assessment of the community. But also not just sort of bringing experts in to talk to the community, but hearing directly from the community and bringing very diverse members of the community together, including the young people who are being harassed by the police and feel persecuted by the police.
Yeah, so I agree, and what I will say to that is stay tuned. You guys know my partner in crime, Assemblymember Diana Richardson. We're working on some things that are going to facilitate exactly what you're talking about. Actually, right before I got sick, we held 2 of these sort of discussions around the uptick in violence on Hawthorne Avenue. And we brought in everybody, everybody, the guys, the people, the families on the street, the homeowners, everyone, and had the police department there, but had clergy there, had other community leaders there. And it was very useful, right? People got raw about their feelings and said, look, I don't feel safe at this certain, time. And the other folks said, well, I don't feel safe when I see a bunch of cops on the block. And I think we had a pretty honest exchange where it was good for the PD folks that were there to hear that there's a balance that you have to strike. And I will say this, I know we're running out of time, but I just want to say that the folks, some of the street cops that I have a relationship with, they have a very different approach than what you hear from the leadership in the department. And I get really incensed about this, particularly on the commissioner's end, because Commissioner Shea is out here saying crazy stuff on a regular basis and commenting on policy and saying things that are not based in data and are really inflammatory, quite frankly, and are at odds with the people, the police officers on the ground. And so there are within that own structure, the institutional hierarchy ends up hurting us because they, there's this conflict. And so anyways, I just wanted to say that before we move to the next question.
All right, I'm looking at the questions that have been upvoted. So if you see questions in the Q&A that you're like, we have to get to this, like give it a vote, and we may have time for it. Laura says, as defund the police becomes a more mainstream concept, candidates seeking election have started or will start to make promises about their approaches to policing. How do we push them to turn that talk into real commitment and hold electeds accountable once they're in office? So Zellnor, maybe you want to start with that one, and then Alex.
Yeah, no, I'll just say on the accountability piece, like, I'm not hard to find. I think it's important. I think a lot of times people treat elections, sort of like set it and forget it. You vote, and then you don't hear from us, until the next election. And I think it's important that when candidates are making pledges and saying what they're going to do, that the time that you were most involved in doing FaceTime or communications should not just be around election time, but that you need to follow up with folks, because here's how it works. I try to be as proactive as possible. I represent almost 320,000 people. There's no way that I'm going to have 320,000 conversations. And so I try to get to as many pockets as possible. But then there's a lot of incoming traffic as well. And there are folks that I hear from all the time. And that's like, sometimes it's great and then you love it. And sometimes it's not so great. And people telling me that I'm this, that, and the third, and need to do more. But on both of those ends, at least I'm aware of the position and the level of accountability that I need to bring to the work that I do. So I would just encourage folks election day is great, amazing, get your candidate in, but the real work happens when they're in office, and that's when you got to put the pressure on.
I'm not looking for politicians to mouth some 3-word phrase and then, oh, they're on my side, right? I want to see the plan. What's the vision for the kinds of interventions that are going to make the community safer than they are today? Because that's got to be the bottom line here. Do you have a plan to make this community a healthier, safer place? And if your plan for doing that is just to hire more police, that's not a plan. And if your plan is just to cut the police force by some certain number, that's not a plan either. The plan has to be rooted in an assessment of community needs, an assessment of community strengths and resources, and some concrete talk about what needs to be added to that to make this a better community to live in. And is this person connected to the institutions and the organizations that will be in a position to do this work? And then we don't have to just take their word for it to the same extent.
All right, maybe 1 or 2 more questions. This one is from Tracy, who says, I'm interested in what any of the panelists have to say about the current state of mental health concerns in policing. My work is focused on bringing psychological services back into the community, including integrating with first responders. I'd like to know more about what you think is being done or should be done on local and state levels to redirect the focus around mental health issues like domestic violence and psychotic episodes. And she thanks you for your comments. So Alex, do you want to start with that question?
So look, we have systematically defunded mental health services. We closed down the state hospitals, which were, deeply problematic places, but we were told that the savings that accrued from that would be redirected into community level services so that people could live independently with dignity and security. And those community level investments from the feds to the state to the city never materialized. And so people have been left on their own. Families have been left on their own. And in the absence of credible, community-based, regular services, people call 911. And because we don't have any other system in place, they send the police. In New York, the NYPD goes on 250,000 mental health crisis calls every year. It is a huge part of how they spend their time. And no matter how well they handle these cases, nothing really good comes out of it because it never leads to real stability for that person or their family. So we need to not just create mental health crisis teams, which the city's experimenting with. I have some problems with that model, but we also need to create the baseline services, including very simple peer-to-peer respite centers without a lot of doctors, and that where people in crisis can have a timeout and get some support and get some advice about what to do next. Do they need medication? Do they need talk therapy? Do they just need a safe place to sleep for a couple of nights to get their head together, right? And then more serious services if that's what's needed. I think Jumaane Williams's report on this subject is very elucidating, and I highly recommend it.
I wonder, yeah, we have like 4 minutes left, and I know it's a hard stop at 7 o'clock. If both of you could, in like a minute or 2 minutes, tell us what you think we should do from here on in. Where do we go from here? What can this community do to begin to solve these problems?
Yes, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I mentioned at the top the Community Violence Intervention Act that we passed. And this to me was a sort of labor of passion. I worked on this from my COVID bed to get it in the budget because I really do believe that the solution to crime prevention and intervention has to come from community models. And we work very closely with the violence interrupters in PLG, but also across Central Brooklyn. We work very closely with the hospital-based intervention programs. We know the victims of gunshots are more likely to be repeat victims if there's not intervention immediately with the services that they need. And that's what the hospital-based model does. And so I would encourage the entire community. We are going to be bringing down a lot of resources from the state, from the federal government as well, into community-based violence intervention. And I think that is a tangible plan that you can see in action and you will see on the streets this summer.
I just want to take my 2 minutes to address some stuff in the chat, if I could, which is this idea that, if we don't have police, people are going to come rob me and kill me in my home, and that the policing is the only possible strategy we can rely on to keep us safe. And there are three fundamental problems with this viewpoint. One is that it grossly overestimates the effectiveness of policing. The fact is that most violent crime isn't even reported to the police. People don't call the police already because they have had bad experiences. The police are not solving their problems. In fact, sometimes the police are making their problems worse. So we like to imagine that there's this magically perfect police department like we see on television, and we call them and all of a sudden all our problems are solved and we're safe. And this just isn't people's actual experience. The second is that we fail to calculate the costs of that system. We just imagine it's cost-free, it's perfect, and it does everything we want it to do. But it comes with costs. Even when we think it works, even when they stop some person with a gun, this has a cost. It has a financial cost, but it also places a whole set of burdens on communities because it's rooted in a politics and an ideology and a set of practices of punishment, of retribution, of defining people as moral and social failures and canceling them. And finally, it fails to consider the alternatives, that policing is not the only possible tool we could mobilize to prevent burglaries, to help people deal with the after effects of a burglary, because police only come after the burglary has already happened. They never prevent a burglary. They come after we've waited hours, they fill out some paperwork, and it turns out the majority of burglaries are never even investigated in any meaningful way. We need better strategies. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks Zellnor and Brenda and Deborah for being part of this. I'm sorry that we have to wrap it up. Obviously, there's so much more to say, but we appreciate all of you so much. And the recording of this event will be up on YouTube within the next couple of days. We appreciate PLGNA and all of the members of our communities. And thank you so much for spending time together tonight.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you so much. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate